the cabin in the woods, a group of friends, oblivious to the imminent danger that awaited them, settled into the cozy cabin. They built a roaring fire, cracked open some frosty beers, and told bone-chilling ghost stories, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that hung over them like a dense fog. As the night warmed, the woods surrounding them seemed to come alive with an eerie energy. Branches snapped and leaves rustled, as though something sinister was lurking just beyond the trees. Strange shadows danced in the darkness, heightening the group's fear. The group attempted to dismiss their apprehension as mere paranoia, but the unsettling feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly Mike, who had gone outside to relieve himself, vanished without a trace. Kelly, who set out to search for him, was the next to disappear into the ominous woods. Finally, Sarah, who went to inspect the generator, was also taken by the unknown force. The remaining friends were left huddled together, shivering in fear and completely alone. They heard inexplicable sounds outside the cabin, such as crunching footsteps on the leaves and the unsettling sound of something scratching at the door. All of a sudden, they saw him, the infamous Night Stalker, standing outside the cabin, his eyes eerily glowing in the pitch-black darkness. He beckoned to them, inviting them to come outside and play. The group knew they had to escape, but with the woods outside being too perilous and the Night Stalker waiting for them, they felt trapped with no way out. As a last resort, they concocted a daring plan. They decided to make a run for it, all at once, hoping to overwhelm the Night Stalker with their sheer numbers. It was an unlikely plan, but it was their only hope of survival. Without a moment to lose, they burst out of the cabin, shouting and screaming, and charged towards the woods. To their surprise, it worked, and they managed to bypass the Night Stalker for a fleeting moment. But then they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was the sound of the Night Stalker's laughter, which they knew spelled doom for them. They ran for their lives, their hearts pounding in their chests. But it was too late. The Night Stalker caught them one by one, dragging them back into the woods, and they were never seen again. The cabin in the woods stood desolate, dark, and foreboding, a place that no one dared to enter. Some claim that on quiet nights, you can still hear the Night Stalker's haunting laughter echoing through the trees. Years passed, and the cabin became nothing more than a legendary tale. A cautionary story for those who dared to venture too far into the forest. But for one group of teenagers, the legend was too tempting to ignore. They had heard the stories of the Night Stalker and the cabin in the woods, and they were eager to test their courage by spending a night there. The group snuck out of their homes, packed some supplies, and made their way into the woods. As they drew near to the cabin, they felt a sense of dread wash over them. It was even more sinister and creepy than they had imagined, with its dark and twisted wood and broken windows. However, their determination to prove their courage spurred them on. Once inside, they set up their sleeping bags and began sharing spine-chilling stories, trying to frighten each other. But as the night wore on, strange occurrences began to take place. Footsteps could be heard in the hallway. Katie, the bravest of the group, decided to investigate. She tiptoed down the hallway, her heart racing in her chest, and pushed open a creaky old door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. She could barely see anything in the darkness, but she could hear the sound of something breathing. She stepped forward, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, and saw him, the Night Stalker, sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, his eyes glowing in the dark. He was even more terrifying than she had imagined, with his long, twisted limbs and sharp, pointed teeth. For a moment, Katie froze. She wanted to run, to scream for help, but she knew it was too late. The Night Stalker had seen her, and he was coming for her. She tried to back away, but her foot caught on a loose board, and she stumbled. The Night Stalker lunged at her, his claws stretched, and grabbed her by the throat. She could feel his cold, bony fingers tightening around her windpipe, cutting off her. But Katie struggled, kicking and flailing, but it was no use. The Night Stalker was too strong. She could feel herself growing weaker by the second, her vision growing dim. And then suddenly the pressure was gone. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath, and looked up. The Night Stalker was gone. Katie stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest, and ran back to the others. They could see the terror in her eyes, and they knew that something was wrong. They tried to leave, to run back through the woods to safety, but it was too late. The Night Stalker was waiting for them, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He beckoned to them, inviting them to come out and play. They knew they had to fight, to stand together and fight for their lives. They charged the Night Stalker, screaming and shouting, and for a moment it worked, and they managed to get past him, running deeper into the woods. But the Night Stalker was relentless. He chased them, his long, twisted limbs moving impossibly fast. They could hear his laughter echoing through the trees, and they knew that he was gaining on them. And then suddenly they were free. They burst out of the woods panting and sweating and stumbled onto a road. They could see the lights of a town in the distance, and they knew that they were safe. They looked back, expecting to see the Night Stalker chasing them. But he was gone. They never saw him again. The group of friends made it back to their homes, shaken and traumatized by their experience. They knew that they had been lucky to escape with their lives. Years later, they would still talk about that night, about the terror they had felt, and the evil that had pursued them. And some would say that the cabin in the woods was cursed, that it was a place where darkness and fear reigned, and that the Night Stalker was still out there, waiting for his next victim to come. The dark alley. Sarah had always been circumspect while walking home from work, but tonight, an ineffable feeling of unease clung to her. The atmosphere seemed pregnant with an ominous premonition, making her uneasy despite her attempts to brush off the feeling. The dark alley that was the shortest route home loomed before her, and her heart began to beat frantically. As she entered the alley, Sarah was certain she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to look, but there was nobody there. She tried to hasten her pace, but the footsteps only seemed to get louder and closer. Abruptly, a hand reached out from the darkness and grabbed her from behind, causing her to shriek in horror. She whirled around to face her assailant, but could only make out the shape of a shadowy figure obscured in darkness. In the midst of her struggle to break free, Sarah felt an acute pain in her neck, and her vision faded into darkness. When she came to, Sarah was sprawled on the frigid ground of the alley, her body numb and her mind spinning. She attempted to stand up, but she was immobilized, unable to move from the neck down. A voice pierced the silence, and it sent shivers down her spine. The growling, guttural voice of her attacker. "You're mine now. You belong to the Night Stalkers." There she lay, incapacitated and alone, with the realization that the Night Stalker had claimed her as his next prey. The darkness engulfed her, and escape was not an option. For an indefinite period, Sarah lay in the alley, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat and the Night Stalker's heavy breathing. She knew that she had to act, but her body was immobile. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear, and it was her own fight back. "You have the power to overcome this." Summoning every ounce of willpower, Sarah forced herself to move. She lifted her arm gradually and swung at the Night Stalker with all her might. Her hand struck something solid, eliciting a howl of agony from her attacker. The Night Stalker staggered backward, and in a moment of clarity, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face. It was distorted and twisted, with eyes that glowed like fiery coals in the darkness. She knew then that this was no ordinary assailant. This was a creature of pure evil. With the last vestiges of her strength, Sarah crawled towards the safety of the street. Although she was aware that the Night Stalker was still out there, lying in wait for his next victim, she also knew that she had survived. Her survival instilled her with a resolute sense of determination. She would not allow the darkness to conquer her. Years later, Sarah wrote a book about her encounter with the Night Stalker, and it became a bestseller. But for her, the most significant accomplishment was her triumph over fear and the discovery of her strength to fight back against the darkness. The ghost train. The decrepit train tracks that snaked their way through the town had long been both a source of trepidation and curiosity for the locals. The rusted tracks led to an abandoned train station that had been shrouded in mystery for years. Many had dared to explore the station, but few had returned to tell the tale. One fateful night, a group of teenagers, emboldened by the thrill of the unknown, decided to venture into the abandoned station. Little did they know that their innocent curiosity would lead them down a path of darkness and terror. As they made their way through the creaking station, the air grew thick with an eerie silence that seemed to amplify every sound. The group felt their skin prickle with an intangible sense of danger, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. Suddenly, whispers began to fill the air, barely audible at first, but growing in intensity as the teenagers ventured deeper into the station. The whispers seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves, carrying with them a sinister energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The air grew colder, and the group found themselves shivering as they explored the dilapidated trains and stations. They felt as though they were walking through a dreamscape, where reality and nightmare blurred together in a surreal and terrifying haze. It was then that they heard it, the distant sound of a train whistle, growing louder and more urgent with each passing moment. The group realized too late that they were trapped on the tracks, with no way to escape the speeding locomotive hurtling towards them. As the train approached, they heard the sinister laughter of the Night Stalker, the infamous serial killer whose victims were said to haunt the train tracks. Panic set in as the group realized that they were about to become his next victims. But just as the train was about to collide with them, a blinding flash of light engulfed the station. The teenagers found themselves transported to a different reality, one where the Night Stalker and his victims existed in a perpetual nightmare. As they stumbled back into the real world, shaken and disoriented, they knew that they had come dangerously close to being trapped in the realm of the Night Stalker forever. The experience left them scarred, haunted by the knowledge that the darkness was always lurking just beyond the edge of the light. From that day on, the teenagers never spoke of their experience at the haunted train station. They knew that the Night Stalker was still out there, waiting for his next opportunity to claim his victims. They also knew that the station was a portal to another dimension, one where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred beyond recognition. The abandoned train tracks remained a source of fear and fascination for the town, and the teenagers knew that they could never let their guard down, lest they become the next victims of the Night Stalker's unrelenting thirst for blood. The haunted house. The very moment the youthful family crossed the threshold of the aged Victorian house on Elm Street, an inexplicable feeling permeated the atmosphere. It was as if the walls themselves were guarding secrets that would never be revealed. Despite this, the family was smitten with the classic charm of the dwelling, so they resolved to make it their abode. Initially, the strange happenings were easy to dismiss. A door that refused to stay closed, an unexpected gust of cold air, but with the passage of time, the incidents grew more frequent and more disconcerting. Shadows flitted about in the corners of their vision, whispers reverberated through the halls, and the family felt a constant sense of being observed. Even in isolation, it wasn't until they stumbled upon an old photo album in the attic that they uncovered the truth. The Night Stalker, the infamous serial killer who had sown terror in the town years ago, had once dwelt in their home in that instant. The family knew they had made a fatal blunder by moving in. As the nights grew increasingly murky, the family's terror intensified. The Night Stalker's ghostly presence seemed to lurk around every turn, and they could not shake the sensation that he was still there, lying in wait for his next victim. One evening, the family was jolted awake by a loud banging that seemed to emanate from the basement. Upon investigation, they discovered that the cellar door had been flung open. Tentatively, they descended the steps, the narrow beams of their flashlights scarcely illuminating the way. What awaited them at the foot of the stairs was something out of a nightmare. The Night Stalker's lair, replete with ghastly instruments of torture and a bed on which he had carried out his abominable deed. Yet as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, ensnaring them in the darkness. They cried out and pummeled the door, but no one came to their aid. It was then that they heard the voice of the Night Stalker murmuring in their ears. "You're mine now," he taunted. "You belong to me." The family never escaped the haunted house on Elm Street. They were entrapped there, forever tormented by the Night Stalker and the unspeakable atrocities he had committed within its walls. Years later, the haunted house on Elm Street remained vacant, its windows boarded up, and its doors firmly locked. No one was willing to inhabit a place with such a gruesome history. Nonetheless, some claim that on still nights, you can still hear the whispers of the Night Stalker and the screams of his victims echoing throughout the halls. It is rumored that the Night Stalker's spirit still roams the corridors of the house, seeking out new victims to add to his collection, and some assert that if you listen carefully enough, you can hear his spectral footsteps creeping up behind you in the dark. The town's inhabitants avoid the house at all costs, but there are always a few audacious souls who are willing to test their mettle. They arrive in groups, equipped with flashlights and cameras, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Yet no one has ever emerged unscathed. Some vanish without a trace, while others return irrevocably altered, haunted by the horrors they encountered within the walls of the haunted house. The Night Stalker may be gone, but his legacy endures. And as long as the haunted house on Elm Street remains standing, the darkness will continue to claim its victims. The hospital, the edifice of healing and hope, once the hospital's hallmark, had transmogrified into an abode of dread and death. Nobody knew when or whom the Night Stalker would prey on next. The hospital staff perpetually dwelled in a state of panic, their heads swiveling round to catch a glimpse of their surroundings and their ears perked up to pick up on every sound. The police force, left at a loss, was unable to find any evidence, leads or clues, rendering the Night Stalker a phantom, silently gliding through the hospital and leaving in its wake nothing but mayhem and ruin. But one fateful night, a nurse, by sheer happenstance, stumbled upon something that would entirely overhaul the case. In a dark nook of the hospital, she discovered a room that had been barricaded and forgotten, and within its walls she found a journal filled with the lunatic diatribes of a man who identified himself as the Night Stalker. As she pored over the pages, a sense of foreboding washed over her. The diary was a veritable compendium of the murders recorded in a warped and feverish handwriting. But as she read further, she realized that the Night Stalker wasn't only a killer but a patient at the hospital. The staff scoured the hospital, reaching their way through every nook and cranny, until finally they stumbled upon the Night Stalker. He was huddled up in a dark corner, his eyes crazed, and his teeth bared in a vicious grin. A brutal altercation ensued, but ultimately they managed to subdue him and arrest him. The Night Stalker's journal became the centerpiece of his trial, and he was meted out a life sentence in a maximum security psychiatric institution. However, even as they escorted him away, the hospital staff couldn't dispel the sensation that something ominous and sinister still lurked in the shadows, biding its time to strike again. Time trudged on, and the hospital tried to move on from the atrocity that had unfolded within its walls. However, the memory of the Night Stalker lingered like an indelible blot that wouldn't dissipate. Some staff members reported unsettling happenings, such as objects shifting by themselves and murmurs resonating in the halls. And then one night, the hospital was plunged into darkness due to a power outage. The backup generators failed to function, and the staff had to navigate the pitch-black passageways, their only guide being the flicker of their flashlights. It was then that the whispers resumed louder than ever before, and the staff comprehended that they weren't alone. They heard the sound of footsteps, deliberate and sluggish, echoing through the halls. The creaking of doors opening and shutting, and the sound of something being dragged along the floor reached their ears, and then they heard a voice that sent chills down their spines. It was the voice of the Night Stalker, and he had returned. The staff frantically scurried through the hospital, endeavoring to find an exit, but every avenue was obstructed. They heard the Night Stalker's peals of laughter reverberating through the halls, and they knew that he was toying with them. In the end, only a handful of them managed to escape alive. The hospital was shuttered down, deemed too hazardous for anyone to enter, but some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the whispers of the Night Stalker and the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty halls.